I can be loud. Hold it closer. This volume.
Become a rock star.
Little, yeah. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming to our second of this year's Distinguished Lecture Series at the University of Maine Presque Isle. We have a great speaker tonight. Dr. Bernd Heinrich is originally from Germany. He came to Welton, Maine, which is just outside Farmington when he was a kid. Then he continued doing his undergraduate and master's degree in the state of Maine at the University of Maine at Ordo. Went west, went to UCLA where he did his PhD and his postdoctoral work, and then came back to New England where he took a position at the University of Vermont where he is today a professor emeritus. Dr. Heinrich, is a prolific author and a prolific scientist. He's a naturalist author. He's published more than 125 different first author publications. He has numerous popular science articles and has over 25 different books published on a wide variety of topics, which is really impressive. Topics ranging from bee temperature regulation to bird behavior to how different animals share different foods, and all the way down to marathon running. Actually, did you know our guest speaker tonight is in the Maine Runners Hall of Fame and the Maine Sportsman Hall of Fame? For good reason. He's held numerous world and national records for tracks with an ultra-marathon specialization, running 24 hours at a time sometimes and 100-mile stretches. Pretty impressive stuff. He's had a documentary about him and his life and his perspective on his life. What I think is really impressive is I went to the Goodreads.com website, which is a website where people can share reviews about their books. And I went through, there's 8,000 different ratings, there's just of his books, there's 1,000 different fully written reviews. He has a 4.0 average out of 5 of all of his 25 different books across those 8,000 ratings. And I went through, and I suggest you do this, go through and look at some of the comments that they gave. So Amanda took a couple that I thought was fine. I'm not going to try to remember that part. So here's a couple of comments that really jumped out. If you like nature books in particular, and I can't think of any writer more enjoyable than Bernd Heinrich. Another one, this one's my favorite. I accidentally read this, and then I purposely read everything else he wrote. And then finally, each of us will find a book that changes our life, or at very least one which stays with us for a lifetime. This book is one of less than 5 books in my life that truly and deeply stays with me. And as we'll see tonight, Dr. Heinrich has a way to bring science and nature in a very clear and simple way. He likes to take humor and art and combine them in his writings with science and nature. And I think it's really approachable. And so I'm really thrilled tonight to bring Dr. Heinrich out and talk to us about a topic that is not actually the one he originally told us. So I'm going to leave him to tell us the title and take it away.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back in the county. It's been since 1961 that I was here last. Spent some time in the woods there in Allagash, marking timber for IP Paper Company when I was still in forestry school. So, anyways, as we just heard, I have ranged widely here, and the topic, I don't even remember mentioning the title. I think what happened was about back in April I was asked, what I was going to talk about, and I said, well, the physiological ability of insects and birds to adapt to different environments. So, what I was actually, my topic of the lecture was going to be, I had no idea. I couldn't think about the topic of a lecture until about a week before I'd give it. So it was a very broad topic, and I just noticed it when I looked at the advertisement here last week to see what it was going to be about. So actually, it is fairly broad, and for what I usually talk about, In one way, it's not broad enough because the ability of different birds and insects to adapt to environment is not only physiological ability, it's also behavioral. And so behavior is one of my themes too. So in any case, so this was the title, and if it's going to be this broad, I really feel that I would get very distracted by pictures. You know, to show up pretty pictures, we want to look at it for a long time. And so I'd rather talk a lot. So, but where to begin? Well, I've got to assume I was invited to talk about my research, and most of it, as we just heard, is probably fairly inaccessible because it's in all kinds of specialized research journals, and it is extremely diverse. So, I mean, a lot of people would say, well, I'm a dabbler, I'm a dilettante, and a half scholar, as opposed to a real scholar who's a specialist. Well, I consider myself, I consider it different. Actually, I think to the contrary, I've been the opposite. I always try to get into more and more details and to keep tracking the topic, and it just turns into something else. You know, I'm just like following a track wherever it goes. And it doesn't always go straight. It goes in all kinds of different directions. So probably, scientifically, what I'm probably best known for, I think, is climbing up into trees and watching ravens back in western Maine. But I actually got my PhD at UCLA for work in the lab, working with sphinx moths. So where are the connections now from sphinx moths to watching ravens in the Maine woods, up in the trees? Well, so I want to kind of follow the track and talk about the interconnections. And science, of course, builds on previous work, and that's stimulated by new observations. And I am an avid field naturalist, and I made lots of observations of animals and plants as a kid, and that was through contact. I collected moths and butterflies and raised them from caterpillars, and so I was interested in the details and very fascinated by the beauty of these creatures, and I think that's where a lot of science comes from, is from looking at the beauty and of the appearance first, and then getting more interested in it and wanting to take it with you, and then you end up collecting the things, and I was collecting moths. And but in this case, when I was at UCLA, I read a paper in Science journal, and or it may have been Nature, one of the leading science journals. I was searching for a research topic to do a PhD on, which is the hardest thing, to find something that where you can really make a mark on something new. And anyways, in this paper, they talked about body temperature regulation in a sphinx moth. Sphinx moths are these moths that you see that look a little bit like hummingbirds. They hover in front of flowers, and some of them fly in the daytime. And anyway, in this paper, they claimed that the moths regulated their body temperature by regulating their heat production. That makes sense. In other words, they had the same body temperature regardless what the air temperature was, which means to keep the body temperature stable, they had to increase the heat production. If it got colder, they had to produce more heat as you put more coals into the furnace. So, and we know that the moths, not just moths, but many insects, they produce heat by shivering. And so they warm up before flight, and they call it pre-flight warm-up. Now, many of you may have found insects, and you pick them up, let's say a moth or a bee, and it can't fly, and then somehow you miraculously revive it and it flies off. Well, actually what it just did was warm up for flight, get ready for flight. So you didn't do anything miraculous except to wake it up, essentially, and get it to shiver. And the shivering isn't always visible because some insects can shiver with their flight muscles without showing any any motion of the wings. What they do is they vibrate the flight muscles. And bees and wasps, for example, can unlock the wings from the muscles over the back so that they hold still. So it's like putting in the clutch in the motor. They unclutch the motor from the wheels. They unclutch it from the wings. But some have them still a little bit detached, so in moths you see the fluttering. That's when they're shivering. Okay, so any of you athletes will know that, you know, before you really put on your biggest performance, you have to warm up. So in the case of the insects, they have to warm up pretty near death as far as their movement is concerned. They have to shiver all the way up from air temperature to flight temperature. Okay, well, as I said, I was interested in moths and had watched moths in the field and had collected them, and so I knew a lot about moths. And I couldn't imagine a moth using the muscles for a certain flight frequency and shivering at the same time. How could it shiver more at lower temperature and have the same wing beat frequency? So, you know, I had to find out how they might do that. And, but basically, I didn't quite believe it was possible. I thought there was something wrong with the study. First of all, because it had been done basically in a bottle where the animal couldn't really fly and elevate itself. That's one of the things. So anyways, the point is, here was a potential problem. Here was an enigma, and I wanted to find out what was going on. And so I had to do all kinds of things, like measure the wing beat frequency. You can do that with a stroboscope. So I used the stroboscope and had to fly them in a little atmosphere in a big jar and measure the oxygen concentration, see if they could drive the oxygen concentration down, so I could see how fast they were driving it down, see how fast they were burning up energy. And I had to take the body temperatures, of course, and with insects, you can use very, very fine thermocouples. It's a couple of wires together, almost like a needle, and you can stick that in and you can take the temperature. So actually I was working in a lab where people were working with lizards in the desert, and what they do is they take them like a fishing pole on a noose, and they would catch them and pull them up and then take their temperature. They call it the noosing and goosing technique. But so I did the same, similar, except I called it the grabbing and stabbing. So the moths would be flying, I'd grab it and stab it and take its temperature. So anyway, they did regulate their temperature in flight, but ultimately I found out that what they were doing was not regulating temperature by heat production. They were doing it precisely by the opposite, by regulating heat loss. So here was this journal article saying it was by heat production, and I showed it was totally the opposite. It was by heat loss. And this was due to some presumptions in the way the study was done. I did some experiment, and I think a whole number of them, including making sure they were actually in continuous flight and not stopping flight, but also doing surgery with the moths. So the one piece which I'm most proud of, right after that I could have an article in Science magazine, was when I did basically heart surgery on a moth and eliminated what I thought was the cooling mechanism. And I thought the cooling mechanism was that they were using the abdomen as a heat radiator, like a radiator of a car, and it's connected by a hose, and I snipped and I tied the hose shut so it couldn't circulate the coolant to the abdomen. And sure enough, when I tied that little tiny vessel shut with a hair, the moths would fly, but then as soon as the body temperature get up to about 110 degrees, they would flop to the floor in the temperature control room, and they couldn't fly anymore because they were overheated. So what happens then, so now I did solve this, and I was really, really proud of it, and they immediately gave me a job at the University of California in Berkeley, where they made me professor, a full professor in 5 years. So, but basically it was because of my work with these moths. But once you, on this one problem, of course, you want to do other things flow out of it. So, for example, it made the prediction that other large insects were large enough to store heat would also be hot. So I had spent a year in Africa with my parents, who were collecting birds for the Yale Peabody Museum, and I was for 1 year as a hunter taxidermist, and also we hunted birds by mist nets, and we were catching not only birds but these pesky big beetles that would go into these nets and get all tangled up whenever there were elephants around, because they were going for the elephant dung. Well, then many years later I thought, well, these beetles would be perfect to test for what the temperatures in continuous flight. It's very difficult to get, to chase an insect and catch it after you know that it's at least flown, so many minutes to get heated up. But here, if you wait at a dung pile of an elephant, and these things come flying in, they've been flying, they're ready, and they've been flying for a while. So anyway, so I did a lot of grabbing and stabbing of beetles at the elephant dung piles. I went back to Africa, and sure enough, these big dung beetles were really, really hot. And then there were little tiny ones that were coming, and they were not hot at all. So body size has a lot to do with it. And basically, the animals regulated their body temperature. At that temperature that they generate in the activity, up to, at a higher, if they really are large, they inevitably heat up. And the biggest problem is then getting rid of it if they're active at a higher temperature. So for example, we have a large body size, and if we are going to be in a very hot environment, chasing prey in the desert, we should want to be able to get rid of heat. Our problem is not going to be hot enough to chase the antelope. It's going to be to keep cool enough. And a matter of fact, many of the antelope in Africa can be chased down, and people have chased them down as long as it's hot. And the reason they can is because we as humans can sweat. We have a very good sweating response, a good way to get rid of a lot of heat. Now you might ask, why doesn't the antelope also sweat that much and also get that same? Well, the problem is sweating uses up a lot of water. And if the antelope is in a drought area and there's no water around, it would confine it to be near water. So with every adaptation, there is a cost, and these vary between different animals in different situations, in different ecological settings. So this then brings in comparative ways of looking at animals in different environments. So the same with the insects. So I looked at dragonflies, the green darners, for example, with big flies, dragonflies that always fly sort of continuous flight when they're hunting. And I predicted that, if my hypothesis is right, well, it wasn't a hypothesis anymore with the moths, but I predicted that with the dragonflies it would be the same. They would probably be quite hot because they're big, and they would shunt heat into the abdomen, the excess heat, if they're flying at the higher temperatures, to get rid of it. And that's exactly what they did. Then when I came to back east, because I wanted to come back home. Basically, I wanted to come back to home, and that's where I am now. So, but for a while I had to be in Vermont to spend just a little time, but now I'm back in Maine. But anyways, so here there are moths which are interesting that fly in the occasionally in the winter or early spring. Sometimes you land in the sap buckets. If you maple sugar, you might find these. Well, the owlet moths are quite a thick-bodied and very furry. And it turns out that they have a lot of fuzz on the thorax, and that insulates them. So that allows them to fly at the lower temperature. If they fly at low temperature, they're insulated pretty well. And if you look at the anatomy, again, you see that the blood circulation is such that there is a counter-current heat exchanger, which is a mechanism of blood flow where heat goes from one vessel to the other and is retained in the source. So they have an anatomy that's very different, so that they can't shunt it in, because the blood that's going in is in contact with the blood coming out, so that the heat going out is immediately returned back in. And then, of course, if you're really looking at a big insect that's furry, and it might have a high body temperature and do something different, it might be bumblebees. So that's where I came to bumblebees. So the interesting thing with bumblebees is they are one of the larger insects that can fly at very low temperatures. Even up in the Arctic, you can find them at near 0 degrees centigrade, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So at the freezing point, they can still be flying, some of the bigger ones anyways. And again, they had this anatomy of a counter-current heat exchanger, which retains heat in the thorax, so that's to keep as much heat as possible in the thorax when they're flying at a very, very low temperature. But it turned out that they can dump a lot of heat into the abdomen, and I found this out when I had them in the lab. And I was raising them. Nice thing about bumblebees, you can almost keep them as pets. And I would catch them in the spring. The queens in the spring, every single one of them is a queen that's flying around, because all the males and all the drones die in the fall. So all of them are queens. And they come out of hibernation in the spring. And I caught them and brought them in the lab and give them some pollen and some sugar water. And some of them started colonies. But the interesting thing was that I found that these queens would now lay their eggs in a pollen clump and then sit on top of it and wrap their abdomen around this pollen clump. And then they started to elevate their temperature, not only the thorax, but also the abdomen, which means they were dumping heat into the abdomen somehow. And this abdomen was slapped onto the brood clump with the eggs and the larvae and heating it. As soon as the bee is off, it cools down. So they're doing exactly the same thing as a hen does when it's sitting on a clutch of eggs. Only the bee does it not just on the eggs, but also on the baby larvae and also on the pupae. So anyway, so here again I had to look at the anatomy, and now I had to look at the physiology, because the anatomy said they shouldn't be able to dump heat, but it turned out there was special physiology where they shunted heat, the blood pulses, first one, then another, then another, and another, so that they didn't contact each other. So I call this an alternating current. An alternating current in which bypassed, and so that they could, the hot blood could bypass the cold blood to get into the abdomen. So this was very interesting, and is something that you get by looking at other species in other situations. It turned out, of course, that the bumblebees, or any bees, when they land on flowers, unlike the sphinx moths, they don't stay in flight, they land on the flower. And then they have the option to stop heat production, because they're no longer working with their muscles, right? The muscles normally in flight are producing all that heat. But as I said, the incubating bee was sitting on the clump and was really heating up. So it was producing heat in the thorax by the flight muscles. And the question then was, again, how? And anyway, so I collaborated with someone at the University of Davis when I was here at Berkeley, and Kammer, and she's an electrophysiologist, so I got expertise in help there in looking at probing actually into the muscles and seeing what's happening. And we could see that the bees would put their muscles into a tetanus. They would contract them against each other, so there's basically no movement. So they were very active, just in consuming as much oxygen, as much work as in flight, but being perfectly stationary by contracting the muscles against each other. So I wondered, if they were also producing heat when they were on the flowers and landed, or just cooled down every time. Well, a bee doesn't stay on a flower very long, so you can't really look at a cooling rate to see if it's stopping heat production, if it's only going to be there for about 5 seconds. But in 5 seconds, a bee could do a lot of shivering. So anyway, what I did was, again, experimentally get them to stop flight, but keeping them totally healthy. Any idea how it might have done that? It was very simple. You got it. Yep, I put in droplets of sugar water onto the flowers, and I know which ones had it, and when the bee landed on that one, I would time how long it was, and it might take 30 seconds, and I'd grab it, stab it, and it'd be just as hot as it was before. So they were producing heat while they were perched on the flower, as long as they were flowers that were rewarding. But then it turned out that on some flowers, such as goldenrod and spirea, field spirea, the bees were just crawling around, and you could shake them off the flower and they would drop. They were not shivering, they were not able to fly. And then I calculated that, I knew how much energy it takes to shiver. It's as energetically vigorous as in flight. So if they had been shivering to keep that hot, they would have been losing energy faster than they were taking it in. So they were balancing the energy budget by staying on a flower where there are many, many little florets. They could crawl all over the place and keep probing all over the place for quite a long time before they get done with the whole inflorescence. So they were not only regulating their behavior, but their physiology. A lot of their behavior is really physiology that we don't see. In this case, there's lots of behavior going on in the muscles, but we don't see it until we probe on the inside. But anyway, so this is where economics comes in, energy economics. So this is where I ended up writing. I thought some of this was a lot more interesting than just something very technical in science research journal where only a handful of people would read it. So I wrote it up for a larger audience, for Scientific American journal for a larger scientific audience. And lo and behold, that happened to be at the time of the energy crisis, when we were running out of oil back there in the 60s. I got calls from the New York Times and wanted me to write an op-ed on the story of the energy economy of the bumblebee. So I says, oh, okay. So, I never thought of doing anything like that, but they asked me, so I said, okay. So the editor there, Herbert Wittgen, he liked it, and he asked me to write another one, so I did. And so then I decided, well, I'll write a book. And so this was my first book, Bumblebee Economics, where I then went from the beginning and talked about all of the very different things that people, if you hadn't seen the connection, it would look like scattershot or buckshot going in all directions. But it was all related, tied together by ecology and behavior, and that related to the economy of the colony. Actually, it related to not only the economy of the colony, but also the ecosystem in two directions. Okay, so let me first talk about the economy of the colony. And this is that, as you can already gather, the bees were gathering nectar and pollen from very different flowers. And it takes very different behavior, for example, just to collect pollen as opposed to collecting nectar. To collect pollen, they have to get dusted with the pollen, then they have to rub it off their fur and put it onto their hind legs, pack it into that, and nectar, they just suck it up. But it turns out flowers are so diverse. I mean, a chironi or a turtlehead flower is kind of very tight, and the bee has to squeeze in there to get it apart, to get at the nectar. And others, like jewelweed, have the nectar hidden in a long tube at the very end. And so it looks like the flowers are making it very difficult for bees, and they want to be pollinated. So, that was counterintuitive. It didn't make any sense that the flowers make it so difficult. Why not have it just open on a plate, So then I got interested in flower morphology and the evolution of different flowers. There isn't only one, you might think, well, there's only one good scent that would really be a great scent to use for attracting, and that all flowers would agree on, this is the best scent to use to attract the bee, this is the best color, maybe it's ultraviolet or something. But it turns out they're all different colors, and all different scents, and all different shapes. So, anyway, but the bees, of course, have done the selecting of the flowers, because the way the flowers are is the ones that the bees have chosen. So how come they've chosen all these different ones? Well, I figured it might be in terms of the individuals. And so I started to follow individual bees. And to do that, It's really not that difficult. I followed bees often for hours at a time in the field, in a bog where I was studying. And one bee, or several bees, I watched every day. And I think one bee I kept track of close to a month, every day. Because it would come back to the same area, and then these bees would eventually specialize. As you can imagine, if the flowers are very different, it takes different skills, and not one bee can have all of those skills. So what happens, once a bee learns the skill of one flower, then it goes to that one and not the other ones, and then it searches out others of that same kind. So if that flower happens to be rare, then one is here and one is over there. The bee's going to fly over all of those others and go to that one. So it gets pollinated. So if they're all the same, the bee would go randomly among everything and nothing would get pollinated. So then I looked at it in terms of the ecosystem, and looked at it in terms of the colony economy too, because you wanted different specialists within the colony to bring in all the different honey from all the different flowers. Because it could happen that, let's say there's goldenrod in bloom, and then they all specialize in goldenrod, and then it starts flowering. What then? No more specialists around. Well, what happens is you find that the bees will start out in their foraging career just like I did starting college, didn't know what to do. I tested this in med school and zoology and forestry and whatnot, and generally eventually found something that I liked, and then became specialized in it. And that's what the bees do. They go out there and sample different flowers when they first emerge out of the hive. So I got bees, after they came out of their cocoon, they have a white fur, and put a little tag on them, see a little blue tag with a number 3, and I watched that particular bee, and had them in an enclosure, quite a bit smaller than this room, but I could watch individuals, and the baby ones as they came out, I'd mark them so I knew how old they were, and I found that when they first came out, they went really nearly over all the flowers, and they looked really clumsy, didn't know what the hell they were doing. And pretty soon they'd find one that they liked, and after a few good trials, they would go directly to the other one. And generally they'd have a major and a minor, just like in college. And but then, after the first batches of bees, they pick all the best flowers and all foraging on the best ones. Well, after a while, they drive into the rewards in that profession way down. So so it's no longer quite so lucrative as it was before, and so some of them start sampling others, and so you get specialists for the other ones. So that related then also to the colony. Okay, I'm running really. I'll just mention now how I got from that to ravens. We know that bees, those bees that specialize on clumped resources, like honeybees in the tropics, they go to flowering trees. There's a big clump, as opposed to actually bumblebees who are more Arctic-oriented on tundra where flowers are scattered. But honeybees will recruit hive mates, colony mates, to specific point sources of food. We know that from the experiments by Carl von Frisch, I hope, who deduced the bee language, where bees in the darkness of the hive can communicate to hive mates the direction and the distance of a good food source. If there's a big tropical tree, whatever, or a big honey pot where there's food for everyone, the bees will arrive there by this communication of the bee dance. Well, solitary animals wouldn't do that. And So having some background and thinking about bees, I was watching, when I came back to Maine and Vermont, at camp one day, and I wrote about it in the book, Ravens in Winter, from the beginning to the end. What happened was I heard lots of raven commotion, and that was a long distance away, at least a mile away. And I know there was a whole bunch of ravens. I was very surprised because I knew ravens nest in solitary pairs, they mate for life, and they chase other ravens away. They're very territorial, but here there definitely were a lot of them, and they were making a lot of noise. So I thought this was very unusual. But it's probably, what people have actually seen for thousands of years, but probably didn't think too much about it because they didn't know about Von Frisch and communication in bees. But anyway, so I was interested, and so I went out, and sure enough, what there was remains of a moose carcass that had been hidden under brush. Apparently a poacher had done it there. There were parts of it. And there were at least 15 ravens around there making a lot of noise. So I felt that this calling was a communication that said, come here, food over here. So that's how I started with ravens, which was a continuation now of the bee studies, really. And again, I did the same thing as with the bees. To get the up-close observations, I marked individual ravens, only now, again, with colored tags, but this time also with radio tags attached, so to be able to track them over long, long distances, and ended up, figuring out what this was all about, because it was very enigmatic and not expected given the prior knowledge. And I think I'm running close to time here because I want to leave lots of time for questions and answers. So I will thank you right now, and I'll be here to answer all your questions, even if the ravens, if that's what you want me to tell you. Thank you very much.
So after answering some questions, Dr. Heinrich has brought several books of his, and we'll be selling them in the lobby afterwards. Also, we'll be willing to sign them for anybody. So, and if we do have some time for questions, does anybody have one?
Well, I'm really curious about the grab and stab business. Is this a one-time thing? You stab it and it dies?
Yeah.
That doesn't seem fair. After all the information you get, you killed it.
Well,
in the name of science.
In the name of science.
Okay.
That's right. Yep. So actually, with a thermocouple, some measurements you can't. There isn't any other way to do it. And the information is priceless. It lives forever. But the bees only live a few weeks. And all of the bees that you see right there, every single bumblebee that you have seen this last summer, you'll never see again. They all will die by the end of the summer. So, they don't. I don't think they feel any pain. I mean, they're not like us. We're mammals and birds, vertebrates. We will feel pain, but I doubt very much that they will feel any pain. You can take a honeybee, if it's sucking up nectar, and if you very carefully snip off its abdomen, it will keep right on sucking. It doesn't even know the difference. You could pull out the legs, and it wouldn't care, So it's not like they're like us.
I want to know what you're working on now.
Well, I planted some chestnut trees back in 1982, just as a Hail Mary shot, I got some chestnut seedlings from Michigan, presumably from trees that were immune because they hadn't got the blight. So I planted them, what the hell. But it turned out they're now producing lots of seeds. And so I've got them right by the cabin, the trees. And in the last couple of years, I found baby chestnut trees all through the woods. So now I knew exactly where those baby chestnuts came from. So I had an idea of how a tree spreads. So here was a perfect opportunity to learn about tree propagation. Not only the distances, but where the young trees would start, but also what spreads them. So I've been interested in the mechanism, and I had watched blue jays. The blue jays were caching the seeds. As you know, blue jays will, all corvids will take food and store it for future use. And normally what they'll do is they'll fly off with it and dig a little hole. You know, if a raven anyway, you'll dig a little hole, chuck it under leaf and crevices. And so I found like caches of these nuts. And by the number of little trees coming up, I know how many nuts were cached there. And I found which were done by squirrels, and which were done by ravens, and how far they go. And then I found out that the seeds, if they're spread onto the ground, actually they don't even survive frost. They turn all mushy inside, but the ones that are buried, so I did it experimentally, burying the seeds 5 centimeters and 10 centimeters. 5 centimeters, most of them froze and died. 10 centimeters, they didn't. But I know that jays didn't do most of them 10 centimeters. But the point is that the depth makes a difference in survival. But so with the year, of course, if they put the seeds down and it snows right off, then chances are they'll be protected. But anyway, so there's some of the variables. So I'm interested in the tree reproduction and that. And I've been doing a number of other smaller things from observations. I was just telling someone I was watching tree swallows who are using apparently mostly white feathers for lining their nest, and I couldn't understand why they were using white feathers when it takes so much effort to find a white feather. I couldn't find them anywhere, but every year there'll always be white feathers. And so I've been working on that, and it turned out that when I was watching closely, I would sit there by this one nest every year, and the male would usually sit up there, and he'd be kind of gurgling and kind of singing and twittering, and the female would be flying back and forth and gathering grass, because most birds, it's a female that builds a nest. Okay, so the female, yeah, okay, that's the way it is. But then, suddenly she lays an egg, and immediately he gets busy, he brings in white feathers. So he did most of the feather carrying. So that made it really interesting. And so that's one problem I've been working on. And while I was doing that, it gets kind of boring because he isn't always flying. It takes maybe a couple of hours or something. He's sitting there, and I had flowers beside me that were planted, some iris flowers. And iris flowers have, as you know, the fall petals, very conspicuous big flower, but it has a flower bud. It's like a spike. And I would notice sometimes that I'd never see anything in between a bud and a flower. There's only buds and only flowers. It can't be. But then one time I noticed, while I was sitting there, because I was there a lot, that boom, it popped open just like that. So I now have a paper in press on I found out, how it happens, that the flower opens. I don't really know why. I think there's some significance with respect to pollination, because it's pollinated by bumblebees, why this is advantageous for this specific plant. But I won't go into all the details on that. But so that's kind of what I've been doing. And I was watching, doing the, from the raven work, had lots and lots of cow carcasses and roadkill. So I got all kinds of carcasses and got the chance to see all kinds of other animals, including maggots, blowflies, and carrion beetles of different kinds. And there's one carrion beetle, Necrophorus, that you may have seen, that's a burying beetle that buries carcasses, right? Well, anyways, it buries small carcasses like birds and mice. So all the mice I trapped out of the cabin, I put out and use them to watch the burying beetles. And I noticed that you know, they're black with bright orange on the top of the wing covers. But when they're flying, they look yellow. They look exactly like a bumblebee. Just exactly, you see no orange whatsoever. So, how could that be? That just didn't make any sense. Well, it turns out they have a trick that makes them mimic a bumblebee. And by mimicking a bumblebee, birds probably won't catch them because they get stung. And so it's a protective resemblance. But anyway, how they go about it is, normally the beetle's elytra, wing covers are like this, and the beetle flips them around like that. So you see the under that he puts to the top, and that's yellow. So instant color change. Anyway, so just by watching closely, see a lot of things, and that's what I'm doing now. Yes?
In this area, how might climate change influence the data and the research that you do?
Well, I think it might affect overwintering a lot. I don't know if I can, and it depends how fast it is. I mean, we've seen some of the bumblebee species practically disappear that I've worked with. But then after a few years, I start seeing them again. I don't know if those are natural cycles of something, some storms or something that early in the spring when they first came out and there weren't any flowers at that time, the same way as sometimes the apple trees get pollinated and sometimes they don't, depending on the weather at the time that the bees are out. So I can't personally parse that out. It takes much longer time frames than I can manage, or will manage.
Any other?
Staying on the bee theme, what are your thoughts on some of the articles that we are struggling with bee populations and potential future impacts?
Potential depopulation and impacts. Well, I see more overpopulation impacts. I think maybe in Aroostook County there might be underpopulation, and maybe some parts of Europe there might be a low population. But there seem to be incredible migrations of people all over the world, probably due to overpopulation. I consider, if I had to live in New York City, that means overpopulation.
Bees, not people.
Oh,
Bees.
bees.
Yeah.
Underpopulation. Okay, you're talking about honeybees, probably.
Yeah. Concern worldwide on honeybee population.
Oh, well, yeah, I would be concerned. But of course, honeybees are an exotic species here in this country. They were introduced from Europe, and bumblebees did quite fine with pollination. I think we might have to adjust and have different practices. I don't think they need to be depopulating. I think if we had local beekeepers keep their own bees and not have truckloads of 1,000 hives traveling across the country, and having monocultures of almonds of thousands of acres where the bees have to be there all at once. It's all a matter of and having maybe more local. I don't think it is a problem. I think the problem is human management, human misunderstanding of the biology to facilitate the best. I mean, these bees are not adapted for this type of thing.
Yeah, well, I hope I'm narrowed down to one. Although I would say that what you've been saying about bees is very fascinating. Watching bees for 40 years as a beekeeper, and watching bumblebees too. I want to get a copy of your Bumblebee Economics. That's one of your books I haven't read yet. But actually, I was going to ask you about moths. And one thing I've been noticing, and I keep wondering, okay, is this just a cycle, or is this something that we're seeing a sea change in the population? And in particular, the large moths, Cecropia, Polyphemus. I know one of your books, downstate there's Prometheus, which I don't think I've ever seen here. But we would have a variable population of, like, let's say, Cecropia moths, because cocoons are real easy to see with those. And for quite a few years, I could always find cocoons out there. Occasionally watch them hatch out. And they disappear.
Yeah, I realize I've been alarmed by that too, because I used to collect caterpillars, and I find them much more seldom now. I know actually at camp there near Weld, I've been keeping track of the Calosomia promethea cocoons. We're collecting in the wintertime and finding that over 90% of them parasitized by little Newman wasps, and the caterpillars in the summer would be parasitized by something else, maybe a fly that is actually one that has been introduced in order to control gypsy moths. And now they ran out of gypsy moths, and now they're going to these other moths. And so, in part, again, it is our own doing. So it seems to be due to parasites.
So do you think then that is something that they won't recover from, or do you think there might be an adaptation?
Well, I think they've just become rarer. I mean, I still see Polyphemus and Luna and Cecropia and Calosomia. I see all of these 4 species, but just in very lower numbers. So I think it's making it harder for the parasites to find them, and so they're going to go down. As soon as they go, the population goes way down. The parasites are going to go way down, and then in local places they might jump back up. But one of those moths lays about 200 eggs, so on average, only 1 out of 200 lives to pass on the genes. So there's a lot of leeway if you get a few coming through. And the species is not extinct. They're just very wide, thinly spread.
So you're still seeing some?
Yeah.
I'll keep looking.
Yeah. Don't see them very often.
No,
But they are there. They are there.
I have 2 questions, if I'm allowed. reconcile the divine with the pragmatic, what you're doing, when you're seeing all these different specialized insects and birds and things, do you spend a lot of time thinking about that aspect of what you're doing?
Well, I'm interested in seeing enigmas, but if there's nothing I can do to solve it, then I'm going to selectively spend my time where I have some hypothesis, where I think something might be done, that I can get some kind of an answer.
So you approach it scientifically,
Yeah.
as opposed. My other question
As
is,
opposed to what?
well, I guess it's more about being spiritual and religious, that you work outside or you're in the outdoors. I think that's enough of a...
Well, yeah, I think the whole thing is I think I can call it spiritual, yeah.
That's what I
Doesn't-
used to do.
I don't think scientific excludes it.
No, nor I.
Yeah.
I thought the reconciliation of it, though, sometimes
Yeah.
is difficult. My other, when you were studying the ravens,
Uh-huh.
what behavior did they exhibit that let you know that they were enjoying your company as much as you were enjoying theirs?
When they follow me around.
That's a curiosity.
Well, but of course it's just for the dinner. But I've got a picture of 5 of them following me around. The ravens, the young ones that I had, they would follow me around until they got so that they could get their own food, and then they go their own way. But crows I've had the same way. They're not really imprinted, except that they follow because they wanted dinner, and they follow wolves around too, as a matter of fact, and they probably followed Aboriginal human hunters around. And I went up to Alaska, actually, Nunavut, with some Eskimos up there, and to see, if they were still following the hunters around. But they were now using snow machines, and so they weren't. But the legends are still there that the people could communicate with the ravens, and they would recognize signals to each other, and would have kind of a symbiotic relationship, which still exists now with wolf packs. For example, in Yellowstone, when the wolves pull down an elk, while they're still in the process, the ravens are already coming in. And when the elk is down, they rip it open, the ravens are right there underfoot, and the wolves do not bother the ravens. Whereas if it was a grouse down there, they would inhale it. So, they have the symbiotic relationship,
But there was no emotions that you saw, you know what I mean?
emotions.
Well, not emotional or passionate, like, it's food-driven and instinct-driven.
Yeah,
There is no...
there's attachment, yeah. But, certainly...
Are you still learning about ravens?
Well, I would like to go to Yellowstone and see, and if I had enough money, I would. But the thing is, what we need is to be able to track ravens over long, long distances with satellite GPS to see where they're going and when they're going. And the wolf packs there are tagged, radio tagged, and the wolves go together. But I'd like to know if certain ravens follow that same wolf pack on a one-to-one basis.
Yeah.
But we don't know that yet.
Okay.
Well, I said I had a few other questions, and I haven't, if I get a chance to get your bumblebee economics, maybe this one will be answered.
Can't
but
hear you.
Hello?
No, no, no.
Oh, all right, sorry. I can talk louder. Okay, one thing I've noticed in watching bees, because I usually am watching my bees quite closely when we come through September, and I want to make sure they have adequate feed. And I watch bees foraging all the time. And I've noticed very often I'll see bumblebees foraging rather late into the fall. It seems to be beyond the time when they'd be raising more brood. And it always kind of, well, what are you doing out here foraging now? Should the queens have already dispersed and everything else? I was just curious whether that's what your take on that would be.
Well, I mean, as long as there's still flowers, there should still be reproduction. They should still be putting out workers, or might still be foraging for raising queens. So if the honeybees are still flying, why not still the bumblebees if there are some flowers? But as soon as the flowers are gone, then the bees are gone. So unless it's just the queens, and they would have to go underground by then. So certainly, if you're seeing any, it's very you'd only see them to they're not going to live very long at all as soon as the flowers are gone, because they would be out of fuel in a day.
So I think we have time for one more question, which is already spoken for. Is it on? No. All right.
I just wondered if you would talk about how you were influenced by the work of your father.
Oh. The question is how I was influenced by the work of my father. My father was a ichneumon wasp specialist, and I think I was influenced quite a lot in that we lived in a cabin in northern Germany for 6 years, and basically living off the land. He didn't have a job. His job continued to be, as back home in Poland, he was still collecting his wasps. So, so he influenced me mostly. That is why we came to America, because he had a friend, a colleague at the University of Michigan, who said, you know, you can't publish your stuff over there, come over here. And so he influenced me a lot, because, you know, if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't be here today. So, but aside from that, in nature itself, I mean, in that forest, we were friends with a forester. It was a big forest reserve. And this forester was interested in moths. And he collected caterpillars. And he and my father would go out, and they would hit trees, put a sheet under there or something, and knock the caterpillars down. And I remember, you know, collecting caterpillars. I really got interested in caterpillars, and then they would raise the caterpillars, and I ended up raising a lot of caterpillars and getting moths. And so the forester would get the moths, and my father would get the ichneumon moths that parasitize the wasps, and I got the caterpillars. So it was a symbiosis all the way around. And, okay, thank you very much.
We do have a small gift to thank you once again from the DLS committee. A two-part gift.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow, that's yours?
No, not one. A little photography.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.